I'll read to you our passage from this morning. If you'd like to grab your Bibles and open them with me, we'll be starting in Luke chapter 22. And then once you've found Luke chapter 22, we'll be reading from verse 63. I'll give you a moment to pull that one up. Luke chapter 22, verse 63. Now, the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, "Prophesy, who is it that struck you?" And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. When day came, the assembly of the elders of the peoples gathered together, both chief priests and scribes. And they led him away to their council, and they said, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I ask, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God." So they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation, forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but he made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him, and Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate, and Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before this they had been at enmity with each other. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who is misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him." But they all cried out together, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder." Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. This week is the second week in our Easter series in which we are journeying through the Gospel of Luke. Last Sunday, we heard from John on Jesus' betrayal in the Garden of Gethsemane, ending with Peter running away, weeping, having just betrayed Jesus by denying him 3 times. This morning, we'll be looking at the passage I've just read, which focuses mainly around Jesus' trial before Pilate, culminating in the dramatic exchange of Jesus for Barabbas. But before we dive in, I'd like to share a story with you all. There was a man who made a living laying bricks. With his hands, he put food on the table, and with his hands, he built a home for his family. One day, he returned from a hard day's work to find his wife there in the doorway, smiling. She had just found out she was pregnant. With his hands, he hugged his wife, and when she gave birth, it was with his hands that he held his son. He loved his son dearly. With his hands, he would pick him up, and on his son's 5th birthday, it was with his hands that he gave him a blue baseball cap. The son loved that cap and would wear it always. In fact, he would frequently get into trouble from his teachers for wearing it in class. Once his peers cottoned on to his behavior, they would tease him, calling him Bluehead. But he loved that cap so much that he didn't care. In fact, in time, he started going himself by that nickname, and people from all over learned to recognize the son by his blue cap. Unfortunately, as this son grew up, he came to fall into the wrong crowd, and over time, his life slowly drifted down a dark path. One day, not long after the son's 18th birthday, the father opened his door to find his son standing there. With his hand, he beckoned his son inside. His son was scared. His son told him how he tried to join a gang, how in order to complete his initiation, he had been ordered to kill a stranger, how his victim had happened to belong to that very same gang he had tried to join, how his friends had now deserted him, and how they were now trying to kill him. The son knew he couldn't linger there, but his father convinced him to stay the night. Once his son fell asleep, with his hand he took the blue baseball cap, and with his hand he opened the front door and stepped out into the night. As planned, wearing the blue baseball cap, he was mistaken for his son and killed in his stead. Through his actions, this man saved the son of the Father. As I mentioned earlier, we are looking at Jesus' trial before Pilate. Given how much Luke elaborates on this section, I think it's worth considering the circumstances that led to Jesus being brought before the Roman governor of Judea. I mean, after all, it's the chief priests and the scribes, the Jewish leaders that want Jesus dead, not the Romans. So why are the Romans involved? I mean, would it not be simpler for the elders to just get the job done themselves? Surely involving a third party adds unnecessary complication. The decision to involve the Romans is easily explained by the fact that at that particular point in history, the Jews were not allowed to execute people. Perhaps we take that for granted, but for much of human history, different cultures have practiced the death penalty. But at this particular time, only the Roman authorities were permitted to carry out a death sentence. Legally speaking, the elders' hands were tied. As such, if they wanted to kill Jesus, they were going to have to get the Romans to do it for them. This, however, presents a challenge for them, as the Romans aren't simply going to off someone just because the Jews asked them to. The Romans had no desire to embroil themselves in domestic Jewish power struggles, nor did they want to weigh in on religious debates. Their focus was strictly on Roman interests. That's to say that they were only really interested in matters related to maintaining Rome's control of the region. They couldn't care less about someone upsetting the religious status quo, but someone's mounting a rebellion, then that's something they'd like to weigh in on. So, for the Jewish leaders to get the Romans to execute Jesus, they were going to have to demonstrate somehow that Jesus was a threat to Rome. That's why, in our passage, immediately before Jesus is brought before Pilate, the Roman governor, Jesus is interrogated by the Jewish council. They need to try and find something they can pin on Jesus that would convince a Roman court to sentence him to death. I think it's pretty clear, given how Jesus has been brought before the council, that they are not interested in discerning the truth of Jesus' identity. When they're asking these questions, they're not asking them out of a genuine desire to know. They're asking them to use something against him later. I mean, perhaps my reasoning is flawed, but I would think that if one genuinely was entertaining the idea that Jesus was the Christ, then one probably wouldn't have arrested him in the dead of night and beaten him until the early hours of the morning. So, when they ask Jesus, "Are you the Christ?" their minds are already made up. To them, there's no way that this could be true. So, they are hoping that through Jesus' answer, they'll be able to use this against him later. Which is precisely why Jesus declines to answer their question and instead calls them out for their plot. He says, "If I answer, you will not believe, and if I ask, you will not answer." Before continuing down, if you'll allow me another slight tangent, I think it is worth exploring why Jesus' answer to this question, why confessing to be the Christ could land him in hot water with the Romans. I mean, I've just said, the Romans don't really care about embroiling themselves in religious concerns, so why would Jesus confessing to be the Christ be a problem for them? To answer this, we must consider who the Christ is from a conceptual point of view. Starting with the word itself, Christ is the Greek form of the Hebrew word Messiah, which literally translates as anointed one. Now, although this is a simple translation, this term is just packed with significance. For, you see, Jewish kings were anointed with oil as a sign of their divine appointment as sovereign. I believe even the British monarch still maintains this tradition. So, to be called anointed one already carries with it a royal connotation. However, beyond simply referring to a king, in the aftermath of Israel's exile and the destruction of their monarchy, the Christ, or the Anointed One, became the title granted to a specific individual, one who had not shown up just yet, but one that God had promised he would send, one to once again rule his people. To grossly oversimplify it, the Christ was God's promised king to Israel. With this in mind, it's clear why the Romans would respond to someone claiming to be the Christ. The appearance of such an individual, someone with a title that has such political significance to it, would surely threaten the power that Rome held. I mean, such was the belief at the time. It's what everyone was expecting that Christ would do. He would show up and he would boot the Romans out. That's what everyone expected. So let's move back to Jesus. He's still before the council, and although he refuses to give a straight answer regarding whether or not he is the Christ, he does still hint at his true identity when he says, "But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God." In this, Jesus references Psalm 110, which opens with, "The Lord said to my Lord, 'Sit at my right hand, and I will make your enemies your footstool.' The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies." Such language clearly describes Israel's king. Without explicitly saying that he is the one spoken of in this psalm, Jesus' implication is not lost on the council, as their follow-up question is, well, are you the Son of God then? For the same reasons I mentioned earlier, Jesus, again, does not give them a straight answer, but despite this, the council seems satisfied with their interrogation. They think they've got what they need. Which finally brings us to Jesus standing before Pilate. With their investigation complete, the Jewish elders make their case to have Jesus put to death. Their argument? Jesus has been misleading the nation by forbidding them to pay taxes to Caesar and claiming to be the Christ. Obviously, their charges are ludicrous. The accusation regarding withholding taxes from Caesar is easily shown to be a blatant fabrication simply by referring back to Jesus' own words on the matter. In chapter 20, Luke records Jesus' answer to this very question. In verse 19 of chapter 20, we read, "The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable," the one Jesus had said just before, "against them. But they feared the people. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. So they asked him, 'Teacher, we know that you speak and teach rightly, and show no partiality, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not?' But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, 'Show me a denarius. Whose likeness and inscription does it have?' They said, 'Caesar's.' And he said to them, 'Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's.' They were not able in the presence of the people to catch him in what he said, but marveling at his answer, they became silent." I can see no way that Jesus saying, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's," could reasonably be construed as anything but arguing for paying taxes to Caesar. So, Jesus is very clearly innocent of this charge. Looking at the other charge brought against him, although we now recognize Jesus as the Christ, at that time, the time of his trial, Jesus had not made a public claim to that title, and he did not affirm it for the elders during his interrogation. And even so, even though he is the Christ, he had no desire or no intention for advancing some political agenda. Jesus' concern was purely spiritual. He was no threat to Rome's control of the region. So, upon Pilate's examination, he declares Jesus innocent, despite the fact that Jesus himself makes no attempt to defend himself. In fact, 3 times during his various interactions, Pilate affirms Jesus' innocence and advocates for his release. Furthermore, Herod makes an identical assessment, despite his obvious contempt for Jesus. Even though Herod and his soldiers both mocked Jesus, he did not pronounce him guilty. Throughout these exchanges, throughout this section, Luke is conveying to us, he's trying to make something very clear to us, and that is, Jesus is innocent. He's undeserving of the death penalty. And in this, we see the great irony. Jesus, Israel's promised king, the Christ, is prosecuted by his own people. And it's a Gentile, a servant of Rome, that is the one that advocates for his life. In Pilate's final attempt to have Jesus released, remembering Jesus' popularity, he appeals to the people. Luke mentions several times in his gospel that it is because of the people that the religious leaders would not confront Jesus out in the open. It's because of them that they would sneak around, that they opted to go after Jesus in the dead of night. Surely those who had so far shielded Jesus from the elders' machinations would also advocate for his freedom. But in a dramatic turn, to borrow from John's message last week, the growing circle of betrayal around Jesus is complete. And those who were once his ally now call for his crucifixion. It's at this point that we meet Barabbas, a man guilty of insurrection, inciting a rebellion, and murder. It is in this man's place that Jesus is taken to be crucified. The name Barabbas means son of the father. Bar, son. Abbas, father. And it is without so much as a word that one son of the father is traded for the other. It is here, in this exchange of the innocent for the guilty, that we find ourselves in the story. For we are all guilty of a form of insurrection. We all, through sin, have chosen to rebel against God, to mount an insurrection, to dethrone God and make ourselves kings of our own lives. We are Barabbas. Yet, it is without any contest that Jesus, the King, takes our place, the place of the rebel, to receive our punishment, death. In my story at the beginning, it was the Father's love that motivated him to take the place of his Son, to spare him from his fate. And it is Jesus' love, God's love, that motivates him to assume our sentence through amazing grace. As Paul says in Romans chapter 5, "For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." So, how are we to respond to such a gift, such grace? I think first and foremost, we need to recognize the gift for what it is and the punishment for which we've been spared, which is what this meal that we're about to partake is for.